So the big news today is the agreement between India and China to resume patrolling or across the line of actual control, announced today by the Ministry of External Affairs, by Foreign Secretary Vikram Misri, no less, at an MEA briefing, talking about how this could lead to disengagement across the line of actual control, as well as potentially a resumption of some sort of normality in the India-China relationship. Joining me now is Shiv, who has covered really some of the problems around this very, very contentious border, because I can tell you when the news broke, the first thing I did was, having to go back and look at the contentious history, where exactly does the de-escalation need to happen, and what exactly this means moving forward. So if I could ask you, Shiv, for your instant reaction in terms of what you thought of when you saw this deal come in, what you make of some of the details that we've seen so far, and just your initial sense of whether this will work or not.
So, when it comes to India and China, my go-to emotion is skepticism always, because it's way too complex an issue for there ever to be some kind of very neatly packaged breakthrough. There's also a context to what we're talking about, because India and China have had border troubles for a very, very long time, and they became almost war-like problems for the first time in our lifetimes in 2020 during the Galwan clash, during a huge deployment of Chinese forces in the eastern Ladakh area, and even though that was a major problem that India and China had faced, there had been some incremental forward movement since then. There have been some disengagements, etc. But for the Indian government to now say that there's going to be a resumption of patrolling, and there are some unanswered questions about what the details of this quote-unquote breakthrough. I'm not being cruel when I say use the air quotes for breakthrough, but I'm just being a little realistic, because we still don't have answers to many of those questions. But skepticism aside, cynicism aside, all disclaimers aside, when it comes to India and China, any forward movement is very, very good news. I have to put that on the table right off the bat. So if you've got, like you said, no less than the Foreign Secretary briefing, you had Dr. S. Jaishankar at an event also say the same thing, when they're both affirming that solid forward movement has taken place, to the extent that a resolution has been reached. And as you and I both know, and Shashank, you cover the External Affairs Ministry, so you know this better. Foreign Office guys don't use the word resolution lightly. When they use the word resolution, it means a very detailed alignment between two sides that don't necessarily agree with each other. And you can't find two better sides to define that picture than India and China. So if they've reached a resolution on the resumption of patrolling in a very, very hostile battlefield that has seen bloodletting, that has seen a war-like situation, that has seen firing, that has seen complete contraventions of the border protocols of the two countries for the first time in 4.5 years, I say bravo, welcome. Let's hope for the best now.
So you are one of the few people who's actually gone down the ground, covered the border. You've seen these places that for most people are places on a map, names on a map. Could you talk to people a little bit about what patrolling rights means exactly? Put that in context. Why does it matter? Why was it stopped? What does the disengagement mean? So if you could just lay out for us why this deal matters, why patrolling rights matter.
So as part of the India-China border protocols, there are various different agreements between the two sides. There's a peace and tranquility agreement. There's a border patrolling agreement, which basically lists out the modalities of patrolling by both sides. It's a very unique situation in the world where these two large military nuclear powered countries, each of which has the capacity to destroy the other and in fact destroy the world with their weapons, has basically said, okay, you and I both don't agree on where the border here is, but let's agree not to harm each other. And let's also agree that we will both be able to patrol our side of this perceived line of actual control. And here are the protocols and rules in such a way that our patrolling and our mutual patrolling never ever escalates into any kind of a confrontation. And this protocol is actually a very, very solid agreement. It's stood India and China in very good stead since the late 70s. In 2020, there were various factors which we can go into later about why China decided to escalate things and disregard those. But The border protocols basically mean that India and China have set routes in these extremely difficult, hostile terrains where they conduct their patrolling. And a patrol is, like the name suggests, it's a group of soldiers, either on foot, sometimes in vehicles as well, conducting physical in-person inspection of routes in such a way that they're able to keep an eye on their area of responsibility. The problem has arisen not just in the friction points since 2020, but like you said, in Depsang and Demchok, where China has blocked a whole host of patrolling routes of the Indian side. India is unable to reach those places. But Shashank, one of the things that's not reported or less reported is that India blocks a whole list of Chinese patrolling routes as well, not just in Depsang but also in Demchok. In Depsang, it must be said that the Chinese have a little bit of an advantage. In Demchok, the advantage is with the Indian army. And I think the fact that after 4.5 years, perhaps the fact that China, which is a country that we can all agree only respects strength, it doesn't respect emotion, it doesn't respect a friendly pat on the back, it doesn't respect any of these notions of fraternity or friendship. It respects strength, and I think that's what India has displayed. The Indian Army most certainly has displayed in all of these areas, and that's the only reason we are now at a point where China is saying, okay, let's take this forward in a positive way.
Right. I really want to talk to you about how you see the Indian military's management of the crisis of the last 4 years, because much and more has been written about maintaining tens of thousands of troops in very hostile terrain, as you were saying, for such a long period of time. But could I ask you a little bit about, because I'm sure our viewers will want to know a little bit about, where does this go from here? We've seen some reporting about the foreign minister himself said that, look, more meetings will have to happen. You've pointed out something that I don't think a lot of people have understood, which is that disengagement is one step. You then need de-escalation, de-induction of forces. Could you explain what the next steps are in what happens?
Absolutely. There? So in some of these places, let's take a kind of worst case scenario in some of these places where the confrontation is taking place, like in the Gogra Hot Springs friction point, where troops were, in some cases, as I understand it, 30 to 40 meters away from each other. 30 to 40 meters is, half of this newsroom really. And it's a very, very small distance. And fully armed troops at that close range to each other basically meant that things could escalate literally at any time. Now, the words disengagement, troop pullback, de-induction, de-escalation, the media tends to use them interchangeably, but that's actually pretty misleading because they all have a very separate meaning. A limited troop pullback basically means that the troops who are like literally on the frontline posts, they're pulled back. So it kind of softens the actual confrontational aspect of where things are at with the standoff. Then you've got disengagement, which is what we're talking about right now, which is where you've got units actually moving back a certain distance, a few kilometers, which basically leaves a kind of either a notified or a non-notified buffer zone, basically saying, okay, we're not going to deploy at the front, you guys also move back, and that's a kind of disengagement. So you're not engaged anymore, and not within firing distance rather from each other. Sure. But de-induction basically is the last step of this process, Shashank, which basically means that the larger theater, the LAC sectors where the Indian and Chinese forces have deployed at division strength, we're talking about hundreds of thousands of troops, vehicles, missiles, aircraft, etc. A de-induction would mean all of those moving back to their quote-unquote peacetime deployment zones. So only when that happens will we be able to look at it as a full return to normalization. But like I said, in India and China, nothing ever happens overnight. Even the smallest incremental forward steps definitely do mean a lot. But I can say, in terms of, since you asked about management by the military, it's been spectacular. It's been we can talk endlessly about how there have been intelligence failures. There has been a late reaction to a scenario that was building up in 2019, 2020. Sure. Perhaps a failure at a leadership level. both both at the systemic level and the army level to respond in time to what was going on. Maybe possibly even a element of denial in the system about what China's intentions were. But having said all of that, I think once the balloon went up, once India realized what was going on, it has responded with almost unprecedented obduracy. It has not given in even a little bit.
Right.
Whether it was Galwan, whether it was hot springs, and believe me, there have been a lot of confrontations which have gone unreported. India hasn't given an inch, literally. And for a country that only respects strength, China is frequently portrayed as a bully who doesn't understand any language except strength.
Right.
The last 4.5 years have been basically that. The Indian Army, the Air Force have basically conveyed that, look, this is how it's going to be.
Right.
So if you want to move forward, that's not going to happen. Strength for strength, that's it.
Understood. Can I ask you a little bit about, you've of course talked to the military, you've met the soldiers on the ground. What is their sense of why this conflict began in the first place? Because that's the big thing, right? A lot of people, the Ministry of External Affairs, when we talk to them, often says that, look, we still don't have a completely compelling reason for us to explain why this happened in the first place in 2020. What Shiv was referring to when he talked about possible intelligence failures or conversations about that was the idea that the Chinese were there in 2020 for regular exercises, and then of course they started making large pushes across the LAC, and then the Indian side did not anticipate that, but then has pushed back significantly afterwards. So can I ask you, what is the military's sense of why this conflict began, what China was looking for? Because I think it might help us unpack why it is now open to putting things back a little.
So the Chinese are in all aspects, but especially in terms of strategic and military objectives, very, very big opportunists. And I'm not saying this in a critical way.
Right.
They know how to find opportunities and create opportunities for them to meet objectives. When I say objectives, some of these could be doctrinal objectives. China has always had territorial objectives. They claim Arunachal Pradesh as their own. They claim much of Ladakh as their own. They have a huge problem with India in Siachen. So there are all these territorial issues that happen. The context of all of this breaking out in 2020, I imagine, is that China was between 2018 and 2019 saw a huge training doctrinal shift. I don't want to go into too many granular details about it, but it basically saw a larger scale training deployment in the on the Tibetan plateau, Xinjiang, and places near the line of actual control. And once these deployments happened, and India, there were no eyebrows raised in India about this deployment, even though it was like a large-scale war-like deployment, because it was couched in it being a training exercise, a large-scale theater-level training exercise. However, I think China's own commitment to seeing its strategic objectives delivered. B, the COVID pandemic providing a kind of huge global distraction for China, which was like sort of enemy number one at that point of time anyway. The fact that India was making very big moves in J&K with the Article 370's abrogation, etc. I'm not saying these are the only reasons, but China has an incredible capacity, and I mean this as a compliment, to zoom out and see the big picture and find avenues for opportunity to achieve or to deliver something that it's been trying to do for a long time. It's trying to do the same thing with Taiwan as well.
Right.
And that's the reason why I think it found a kind of alignment in a distracted world, a world that was on the threshold of a historic pandemic. Clearly, China knew more about it than the rest of the world did, surprise, surprise. And therefore decided that here's a great time to, sort of flex and try and do some of the things that we want to do. They haven't achieved them at all. I think most people, when they try and push the narrative that, oh, China's at your doorstep and China's threatening you on the right outside your home. This has been in many ways, if you look at it from the Chinese side, it's been a mess up.
Right.
They've got this huge deployment. it has achieved nothing strategically apart from get India's guard completely up.
Right.
It's reminded the world that India is that massive bulwark against China. It's confirmed the world's view that if there is one country that can contain China, I mean, regionally, it is only India and nobody else. Right. In many ways, it has I hesitate to use the word backfired, but there has been some backsplash on China. So when you see China now being conciliatory,
right.
And I think not for a moment does anyone who's seasoned as far as China is concerned, by this sudden air of goodwill and conciliatory. All conciliations, all the lightening of the mood, the sweetening of the mood, that is only because strength is being recognized, or that China is playing mind games, or it wants to distract from something else that it's trying to do. I'm not being overly skeptical, but that is the history of how China operates, and India must never ever let its guard down.
Right. And if I could ask you something about what we're going to see over the next couple of months. You said that you were skeptical, and of course you have good reason to be given the history that we've had with the Chinese on this. What do you see as some of, let's say, the potential military pitfalls about enforcing something like this and moving towards deinduction of forces? And what do you see some of the political pitfalls as well? Like, what could stand in the way of where we are right now with this big positive development, which we're still, let's say, cautious optimism, welcoming a cautious optimism, and getting where we want to be? So what are the big pitfalls that could come in the way?
See, one of the good things about this situation, and I hate to say it like that because there are no good things here, is that India and China, I'll speak for India, I won't speak for China, but India never needs to look at the China situation ever again in terms of trust and trust deficit. That trust is gone. It's a thing of the past. Absolutely. It's never going to come back. Nobody is going to try and build confidence and build trust. That trust does not exist, which means that the levers through which India and China now have to engage with each other is deterrence, is disincentives from trying anything like this in the future. Right. It's not going to be India trusting China not to do this again. It's going to be an even bigger Indian response than the one that happened in 2020 that will deter China from thinking about doing anything like this in the future, and vice versa. So I think that kind of military level clarity is going to be very, very important. I don't see India pulling back its troops much from Ladakh ever again, which is actually kind of sad, because for a country that has other economic commitments, one would have hoped that we didn't need to keep forces permanently deployed in high altitude areas and cold areas for such a long time. But that's the way of the world right now. Politically, the pitfalls are not new. The pitfalls are going to be the same. It's going to be that you're dealing with a country for whom not keeping your word, deceptive practices, going back on your word in terms of what you've committed to do in terms of protocols. All of these are very much par for the course. And India should also be a little realistic about some of the things that India isn't really China's sort of strategic focus. It's one territorial thing that it's looking at. But China has got superpower ambitions where it sees itself on par with the United States. And it sees India, it views India as a kind of regional player that's being used by the West in order to contain China. Sure. So India also needs to be realistic about that. Politically speaking, that's what I would say.
Right. So two final questions I want to ask you. One is right on your alley in terms of course, we may go back to a situation where we have some sort of status quo, a new normal with the Chinese on the border. Could I ask you though, in terms of India's defense preparedness and how it views China in terms of the platforms it's willing to invest in terms of the infrastructure it's going to build, do you feel like the tempo has been raised to a level that it's not coming back from? Like we are going to be on a heightened level of preparedness in terms of investing in border infrastructure and so on and so forth that we're not coming back from. This is the new normal.
That's a really great question, and I hope it is the new normal. I hope that we never come down from it. But I have been very, very wrong about this kind of thing in the past. Most defense correspondents are a cynical bunch, especially because even with a standoff, even with a military standoff, you saw the Indian army, the Indian government scurrying around trying to get emergency procurements of
Sure.
weapons and missiles and stuff, which made most people in the public justifiably ask, were we not prepared for this kind of thing?
Right.
You know, were we sitting, this is a country where we fought a terrible war within the 1960s. We've had, you know, the whole world knows about their territorial ambitions and you know, the way they play their game. So why have we been found wanting, you know, for basic equipment only after the balloon has gone up? So I think there was a layer of embarrassment in terms of being unprepared for where things are at. But the many wrongs that were righted as usual reactively by India will hopefully not come back down. I hope they won't be. The aspect of military procurement and modernization, I'm still a little skeptical about whether the tempo will be maintained.
Sure.
Because Indian procurement has been a mess. I will say this for this government, that they've actually done more than most governments in the past have to rationalize, optimize procurement, make sure that we have, you know, made in India sources of weapons and equipment, so that we don't have to depend on foreign sources. So that kind of that's work in progress, but there's still a long way to go. Where I think India is truly shining and doing incredibly well is border infrastructure.
Right.
That kind of aggressiveness with which India has not slowed down even slightly in terms of border roads organization projects, you know, troop establishments, encampments, buildings, etc. in the border areas, has basically sent out a signal to China saying that this was the reason you guys, you know, pretended to deploy here.
Right.
You said you guys had a problem with the infrastructure that we're building on our side, even though you've been building so much on your side. And India has increased the tempo of its, especially road and tunnel infrastructure all along the frontier with China at I think by a factor of 3 to 4 times faster and more. The Indian government just very recently cleared thousands of crores worth of more border infrastructure projects, because there is that recognition, which goes back to your earlier question, that there is something about this. There may be forward movement in terms of resolution, but that there is something very permanent about the way things are at right now.
Right. If I can ask you I might lead you to a slight tangent. You know, before, when at least when I was always in journalism and I was in research analysis, one of the big theories that was being floated around was that the completion of the DSDB Road was one of those things that China looked at as saying that, okay, look, India is improving its military infrastructure, and one of the reasons why they were so aggressive in places like the Galwan Valley was to have some sort of strategic advantage when it came to China's border infrastructure. Could I ask you, do you think that was a line of thinking that was popular in the military, or was that DSDB Road, was that seen as linked to what we saw in 2020 in terms of the Chinese military?
No, most definitely. The DSDB Road is, is a lifeline between the Leh theatre and northern Ladakh, the Depsang Plains and Daulat Beg Oldie, which has an airfield. So it was one of those last bits of road infrastructure that India had kind of delayed so far, presumably because it was sensitive. You know, there are innumerable examples, Shashank, of India going easy on certain elements of infrastructure, building roads, etc., because it might irk China. It might, or it might just start a confrontation which nobody wants, and nobody wants to deal with it. And do we really need this road? Let's just not do it. But the DSDBO road, which had been put off many, many times in the past, became a live, active border roads organization project, because the Depsang standoff, the incursions that the Chinese had made in the DBO Depsang area in, I think, 2006, I think, if I'm not mistaken, for a long time. Oh no, it was a little later than that, 2010, I think. Basically meant that the military was saying that we can no longer live without, a multi-lane connect between the Leh theatre and the Leh sector and northern Ladakh. We can't do it. If having an air bridge is one thing, but the DBO airfield isn't even prepared for large aircraft just yet. It's still a very makeshift kind of landing zone. So for a country like India, for an army like the kind of army that we have, it needs to be 100% reliable road connect between the two sides. And India was completely right about it. When that project started, it immediately triggered a very angry response from the Chinese.
Right.
It became a kind of emotive issue that was seen as having spiraled into the larger standoff. But I imagine that there were more reasons and more triggering points for this kind of thing. But yeah,
Right.
but the good news now is that the DSDB Road is in full swing right now, and things are happening. There are more things happening. Some of which I'm not at a liberty to talk about. But in Eastern Ladakh and elsewhere, the Prime Minister's office and the Defense Ministry have given the Border Roads Organization, virtually a blank check in terms of creating a theater which is basically primed for a very, very fast deployment during war.
Right. If I can ask you then one question on foreign policy and what this means for India's alignment with certain Western countries, because a big part of our calculation when it comes to these countries has always been our border confrontation with China and the fact that we no longer trust the Chinese, and the level of threat perception in India about China has increased. If we were to say in a couple of months, or let's say in a year, find ourselves in a position where we are on a new normal that we can live with China, where our threat levels, where we've still got our guards up, but we feel like that threat perception has gone down somewhat. Do you see it impacting our foreign policy in terms of our alignment with Western countries like the United States if that threat perception from the Chinese has come down?
Great question. A normal relationship with China would, right off the bat, deny. I'm just going to say the West. Forget about the United States, but the West. I'm going to say it would deny the West many pieces of foreign policy leverage that they have with India and China vis-a-vis each other.
Sure.
The West that always views divisions between countries that are far away from them as a way to create conflict and tension, that would be bad news for them. If India and China normalize things, if India and China evolve a new border protocol and start patrolling as friends, if India and China, get to shift their mutual attention away from the border, the troublesome border issue and focus on trade to mutual benefit. If India unbans Chinese apps, I'm just thinking out of the top of my head, and things reach a kind of very, very symbiotic normal between these two Asian giants, that is not good news for the rest of the world. And when I say rest of the world, I mean the West. Especially at a time now when you're seeing huge divisions, emotive divisions between the so-called Anglosphere and the global South, the way India is viewed. I think aspirations towards a normal relationship between India and China must be what both countries want.
Right. Could I ask you though, this is something I've always been curious about, and since I have you here, I'm going to make full use of it. In terms of, India's willingness, for example, the youth Abhyas exercises and so on, the kinds of defense exercises it's been able to do with the Americans, it was a high altitude exercises that previous governments may not have felt. For example, A.K. Antony was someone who, you can correct me if I'm wrong, was always seen as somewhat more risk averse as defense minister working with the Americans because he was afraid of offending the Chinese. This government has been a little more adventurous in that. Do you feel like if this, let's say, stabilization with China works out, do you think that the Indian military and the Indian defense and foreign policy establishment will be more conservative on military cooperation with Western countries in these regards?
I don't think so, because look, India is a country that has demonstrated the ability to have a very robust foreign policy that sort of pitches out in different directions, and without a loss of credibility in any of those directions. We've got look at India's position, and you know this better, Shashank. India has got very good relations with Iran at a time when what's going on is going on. India has got great relations with Russia when what's going on is going on. India has got a fabulous relationship, despite all the all the heat over a bunch of cartoonish pro-Khalistani terrorists who mean nothing beyond their little neighborhoods. India-US relations are fabulously healthy and evolving rapidly. The Quad Malabar exercise has just been completed. India has just signed on for drones, and there are so many other things that are happening between the two countries. So let's never mistake for a moment that this is some kind of black and white issue where increasing proximity between India and China would somehow become a problem between India and the United States. I don't think so. I think India has demonstrated in the worst of situations over the last 3 years, since 2022, that it is capable of being in perhaps the most polarized foreign policy atmosphere on earth, and has very capably navigated it. Imagine a situation where you're stuck between the US and Russia during the Ukraine war, between Israel and Iran during what's going on right now, Bangladesh on your doorstep, this whole thing that's happening with China, the Russia relationship. Hats off to the people who run this.
Right. So my last question, and I know I said last question 5 times, but I must ask this question. Since time immemorial, I think in India there's been 2 camps on how to handle China. Starting in the 1940s and 1950s, you had a much more conciliatory view. Let's say peace through empathy and peace through diplomacy sort of view of how China should be handled, and that was really very much the dominant view, given sometimes the power disparity between the 2 countries. I'm judging by what you're saying, that this new camp of peace through strength, that actually it is, in fact, I may reveal to viewers that I once had a former Indian cabinet minister. I was discussing this issue with them, and they said that, we're actually responsible for what's happened on the border because we have decided to get closer to the Americans. We revived the Quad, and so on. Of course, the Chinese are going to feel threatened by that. That is the peace through diplomacy and peace through empathy camp, right? We must respect China's concerns. There is now, I would say you would agree, that a peace through strength camp, that actually we must invest in more infrastructure, we must invest in deterrence, because that seems to be the only way China will respect us. Do you hope that what we've seen over the last 4 years, and potentially a strong India, a resolute India, has delivered this result? Do you hope that the peace through strength camp will now dominate thinking on China over the next couple of years and decades?
It has to. It's not even a choice anymore, in my view. It simply has to. I mean, I'll give you a very small example, Shashank, which is like, people constantly compare, say, India and a country like Singapore, and say, how are people in India so prone to littering everywhere, and people in Singapore, never litter anywhere, and they're so obedient about littering laws, etc. It wasn't always like that. It's because of fear. It's because of the ferocity and the absolute uniformity and assurance of punishment, fines, imprisonment, etc., that has made fear a culture of obedience and being law-abiding. Similarly, with China, it's not about India. It's not an emotional connect. It's not a Hindi chini bhai bhai. We've got a history, and there is a culture in India to be friendly to others, etc. It has to be about the fear of reprisal, the fear of consequences. Peace through fear it has to be that, because and none of this implies an element of disrespect between the 2 countries. It is a kind of mutual respect where you've got 2 equal and opposing forces, rigid against each other, with the assurance that neither has the elbow room to do anything else. And I think that's where this kind of thing arises. There is no room for anything else here.
Understood. So breaking down for us very comprehensively, giving us more time than I had any right to take. But thank you so much, Shiv, for being so kind with your time and explaining really how we got here, what this new deal that we've heard of today means, sounding a note of cautious optimism, if I may also say, which we're hearing echoed throughout the government, especially in the Ministry of External Affairs as well. Thank you, Shiv, for sitting down with us, explaining what's happening. Thank you so much for watching us here on India Today Global. We will keep you absolutely updated with the story and Prime Minister Narendra Modi's upcoming visit to the BRICS summit.